Thank you very much. Lynn has done a lot of work on this, and I've had an opportunity to chime in on it to take a look at not only the financial impact that we're seeing from this if it's adopted, but also some of the opportunities and some of the complexities of Initiative 1631. The ballot initiative was filed on March 2nd. The supporters include environmental groups, social justice groups and labor unions and so forth. The opposition comes from fossil fuel interests and the Association of Washington Business. The whole idea is to reduce carbon by putting a price on it, and hopefully that will help people to reduce and avoid those costs. But there are also other ways that are the carrot as a part of this proposal we'll be talking about as we go through. But the dollars are for a number of environmental projects that are laid out in the proposed legislation and are available to a number of groups to apply as long as they reduce the impact of carbon emissions in the communities for which they're applying for the funds. So let's start with the cost. And we'll get into individual costs of utilities in a little bit, but I wanted to take a look at this like a 30,000 foot level before we get into that. So the fee would begin in 2020. It'd be $15 a ton. It would increase by $2 annually, a flat fee, plus the inflation rate. And so for our purposes, as we were evaluating some of the comparative costs, we were taking a look at a 3% inflation rate over the period that this is in here. All of the money would go into a specific fund in the state treasury. We'll talk about why that is an important thing as part of this legislation as opposed to the previous one that was produced a couple of years ago. And if adopted, the effective date would be December 6th of this year. But I think this is an interesting nuance, as we've talked before, the difference between a tax and its definition and a fee and its definition. In this legislation that's being introduced, the whole idea is that it is a fee, and if the fee is charged, it can only go to specific uses as defined in the initiative. If it were a tax, then the tax could possibly be diverted to general fund and not go towards its intended use. See light bulb snatching by legislature. So that's an important nuance in this as opposed to Initiative 732 that was a couple of years ago. So the fee is imposed. We're going to specifically talk about electrical utilities in this case because it covers a wide range of functions, but also there are a huge amount of exemptions in this bill as well. So for electrical utilities, generally it would start at the generator as far back in the stream as you could go. But then we have public utilities that are customers of the Bonneville Power Administration. And the Bonneville Power Administration, in its federal role, can't pay taxes and fees, or will not, or does not, or however you want to define it, pay taxes or fees to the state governments. So therefore, the utility, meaning public utilities that are customers, would assume the payment of those fees when we purchase it from the Bonneville Power Administration. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of entities that have an opportunity to get investment funds or credits. We'll get into that in just a moment, but depending on how aggressive you are or what programs you have that are over and above things you're already doing, there's a possibility you could retain 100% of the fee that is charged on you as a utility for the utility itself, as opposed to it all going upstream and you don't see it coming back. So there's a big difference between that and the previous initiative. But there are, as you can see on the slide here, a number of entities other than and including public utilities districts and electrical utilities that have access to these funds for various programs as laid out in the initiative. But this list includes us. So there are funds. The fund is the pollution fund, and this is the one that we really want to focus on. So there are 4 areas that break up this pollution fund. The first one is the Clean Air and Clean Energy Investment Account, and we'll be looking at that more closely. That's most of it, 70%. A quarter of it goes for the Clean Water and Healthy Forest Investment Account, 5% for Healthy Communities Investment Account, and as I mentioned earlier, we can claim credits of up to 100% of the fees, as long as they're approved, that we have a plan. That plan is approved by the Department of Commerce. We report every year, and we update it every 2 years. We'll get into the complexities that may cause a little sand in the gears for utilities in a little bit, but I think it's really important that a lot of this stuff means that we're going to be doing more administrative work while dealing with this. So when we get into the Clean Air and Energy Investment Account, it can only be used for the programs as defined. So let's talk about some of them. The renewable energy resources that are eligible, solar and wind would include that. Improving energy efficiency or reducing carbon emissions, and that could be anything from grid modernization, helping people with distributed generation and things like that. Transportation-related carbon emission reductions. That could be we have more efficient vehicles in our fleet that reduces the emissions. It could be increasing the number of electrical vehicles in your fleet that reduces emissions. Up to and including things, for example, we set up our system so that it can better manage and handle electric vehicle charging stations, both public and in customers' homes. So things like that, those programs would be eligible for us to get some funds back. The other thing is to reduce the amount of driving that occurs in your community. And I think that an example would be the CURB grant that we received, or we're working on getting the final details on to receive, is that we estimated of the 500 some odd end users that would be connected, half of those would be employed folks that are driving to work, and in Mason County your commute's 30 minutes or more. And on top of that, of those people that drive, it's estimated by national standards that half of those could become telecommuters. So if you had a program through telecom that converted folks from commuters to telecommuters, that could be used as a part of your investment on a local level. So they were very creative in the ways and things that you could use to reduce carbon. So the Clean Air and Clean Energy Investment Account is broken up into different chunks underneath it. Of that 70% we talked about earlier that goes to that, 15% of that has to be dedicated to investments to help low-income folks and their energy burden. So the Department of Commerce would draft a plan that prioritizes many different ways to help out, like energy affordability, transportation issues, less reliance on fossil fuels, weatherization, community renewable energy projects. So those are some things that would be used from this account. So that's about 15% of that program. And then on the other hand, about $50 million after 4 years would have to be set aside to help displaced workers and that are affected by the carbon initiative. And that would include, say, for example, someone that works at a fossil fuel energy plant, whether it's natural gas or coal or any other iteration of a fossil fuel. It could be petroleum workers at refineries that are laid off because of lack of demand, things like that. So it would help displaced workers in that account, and $50 million would be set aside for that program. But there are things that we're going to have to watch as this initiative moves along and if it's adopted, because as I mentioned earlier, there are complexities to this. I mean, just taking a look at what we have up here, and I thought we simplified it relatively well. That's a huge menu to look at in terms of what you can do, things you can reduce your liability for under carbon and so forth. So we have a couple of things that are going on in here that we have to keep a watch on. We'd be subjected to the pollution reduction investment plans. This kind of comes back to the idea of local control issues. Rulemaking by various agencies. For Mason PUD 3, there are 2 agencies we'd have to keep our eye on. The Department of Ecology is the one that would come up with the matrix, I can't believe I just used that word, the formula that is used to come up with what your carbon impact is. So we have to keep a close eye and participate in that program. Department of Commerce would come up, for public utilities, would come up with the rulemaking for how we deal with our plans for carbon reduction, our conservation plans, things like that. So we have to be taking a look at the rulemaking there, because the rules aren't in the initiative. The initiative defers the rulemaking to these agencies. I will be cynical about it. because we've seen Initiative 937 and various other rulemaking activities by these agencies. We will have to watch them like a hawk to make sure that they stay within the rails, what's going on here. Another thing, it's kind of a side thing, but I think it's something we need to really keep an eye on, is that we would also be subject to different types of procurement and material standards. So if we're going out to bid, we have to make sure that we have certain types of vendors that we're looking at, certain types of materials we buy that fall within a range of the rules that are set aside by these rulemaking bodies. So there are complexities in the program, complexities in how we operate it, and complexities in how we get it back. So those are all things that we need to keep an eye on and be aware of. So rubber meets the road. So in taking a look at other utilities, I think we have to keep in mind that Mason PUD 3 is comparatively less impacted than other utilities that have stakes in natural gas plants and maybe slicers or others that go out on the market more regularly to get their energy. So if we take into account what the PUD Association provided to us as their first estimated emission level for Mason PUD, I almost used the word guess. But if you take a look at that, we're estimating that in the first year, first year, we would see a financial impact to our customers of $130,000 about. Over that 15-year period through 2035, with the compounding of the $2 each year and the cost of living or the consumer price index, I'm estimating 3%, could be less, could be higher, who knows, but I had to pull a number. In 2035, it'd be $475,000.
That cumulative or annual?
That's annual, yes. So as you're going through each year, as you obviously just caught on, is that we're compounding over that 15 years with that $2 in the consumer price index. And this is also assuming that our carbon emission impact remains level. So that's those are the assumptions that I used. Could be higher, could be less, but there are other variables that are involved here that I think that are really important to keep in mind. I mean, this is based on the fact that we have 98% carbon-free energy under the fuel mix report. Department of Ecology is going to come up with a different way to calculate it. Could be less, could be more carbon emissions, depending on how they calculate it with the data that they seek out to use. So we could see that number is higher. Let's say, for example, the earth crumbles and the Snake River dams are actually removed. Those 4 dams, that's a resource the size of Seattle. What do we replace that with? We replace it with the fastest thing we can build, probably natural gas. Suddenly you've got fossil fuels that are thrown into the mix. There could be a decrement even further to the amount of energy that's generated on the Columbia River that is diverted towards fish programs. So that could push us into the market, which could have more of a mix of fossil fuels. And even the natural gas that is set aside as spinning reserves for renewable energy integration, those types of things. So we have to keep those in mind, that those are variables that could come in and increase this number 10, 20, 30%. So the range that I'm trying to keep in mind is this is best case scenario based on PUD Association information and the fact that we're staying at a pretty level emission. So those are things that would come into the mix as we're looking at it. Lots of exemptions. I'm not going to list them out, but as you take a look on the screen, there are a lot of things that are exempt. My personal favorite are the transition coal type thing for the Centralia steam plant, because that plant is going to be shutting down in 2025. Dude, you're exempt. And other fossil fuels things. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We start talking about local control. Here's where we really need to keep an eye on, other than just the rulemaking, because I don't see utilities on this list at all for the boards that would be controlling the granting of the funds, the philosophical background on how the funds would be used, because each of these funds that we talked about earlier has a different board that oversees them. So as you see here, probably our best chance would be to get somebody from public utilities in the 4 at-large positions. So we cozy up to the governor and say we need somebody on this board. And then the advisory panels for each of those funds come up here, and once again, who's missing? Utilities. So once again, we have to take a look at that and make sure that we're not left out in the cold on giving advice and consent to the governor or the program as we see here. So I'm going to sum this up, and if Lynn has some additions that she'd like to make here, because she did a yeoman's job on pulling a lot of this information out and making it accessible. I'm sure that her brain is full, but full of good information here. So there are a few things that I want to reiterate. First of all, this is a fee, not a tax, so it will be dedicated for the purpose it was intended. So that's the difference between Initiative 732 and this initiative. Public utility districts, to some extent private utilities, and a wide range of other entities that have some role to play in carbon reduction would get fees back for specific uses to reduce carbon emissions. And we would have the opportunity within whatever structure is developed as part of the rulemaking, Mason PV3, to get 100% credit for the funds that are generated by this fee locally. Because of our fuel mix, as I noted earlier, we've heard of some utilities that have much greater or anticipate much greater impacts in finances because of that. But because of our fuel mix, our impact is comparatively lower than other utilities. But then we get into some of the things that we really have to think about. That's the potential loss of local control over how we manage our resources, for our purchasing, our accounting, implementation, and things like that. So we have to increase our capacity to be able to deal with that. The entire implementation of the program is dependent on rulemaking. And we all know how much we love watching the sausage be made in Olympia over many of the issues that directly affect us. And so it presents the possibility of an uncertain determination of our actual liability for carbon emissions. And this could also open the door for greater reach of state government in the philosophical and political realm over how utilities operate in Washington State. A little fly in the ointment to keep in mind: what is the legislature going to do next year? Because there is a push for 100% clean energy standards in Washington State. They may add a further level to this, hopefully not if this initiative is passed, which could cause us to take a look at other impacts in addition to this pancaking issue. I don't think that our brain power is lost here in this regard, because I know that the complexity of the fee credit and grant programs could be greater than the capacity of some utilities to handle. And I have every confidence that if this were passed and PUD3 had to walk the tightrope to get our money back, we would get it back. We have folks that have the ability, the brain power, and the drive to do that. And then the final thing is that we also have to keep an eye on the variables of our power supply. And that variables in the power supply, depending on what's happening with fish and wildlife issues, or renewables, or any other thing, that could increase our liability under the program. So I would want to say that's a nutshell. Let's say it's the casserole for you to consider as a part of this, but it's a very complex issue. There are good things in it, there are questionable things in it, and there are things that are unknowns. Yeah, the unknown unknowns, if you will. And so if there are questions that you would have of us, one thing I want to make clear is we don't make a recommendation on this. We just wanted to bring information to you so you can see some of the things that we found in our evaluation. Lynn and I are available to answer questions you may have.
Joel, can we get a copy of that presentation?
Yes.
Just a copy? That would be handy. I'm compiling a file of all the stuff I've received so far, and at our Energy Northwest meeting later this week, we're going to have a long discussion on that. And Jason has put together some good information too, which I could share with you if you'd like.
I think I have this
We
presentation.
have that? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to go More specifically, back to the level emissions, the concept of the out years to 2035, keeping level emissions. I don't see how that would work in the sense that if there was money coming back to the utility, we would mitigate our emissions by that level of money that we had spent in the first place. And that reduction should, in the out years, should be lower. The number you quoted was somewhere in the neighborhood of $470,000 per year, but that number should be lower because of the investments made in carbon reduction from the money. So
That is true.
It's based on fuel supply, though, right? It's based on fuel mix, not
Yes.
your impact. Does that make sense?
So the fee is actually based on your fuel supply or fuel mix, so this is assuming that our fuel mix stays the same, buying from Bonneville. So all of the measures that we would invest in for fossil fuel reduction on the other end is not how the fee is collected. So it's not based on your impact, it's based on your fuel mix of fuel that you're purchasing.
But as a full requirements customer for Bonneville Power Administration, we seem to be assured at this point through 2028 of having 98% carbon-free energy to put into our fuel mix, and that the reductions would be in fuel efficiencies or different investments to reduce that 2%, which would take our out-year expense lower.
Well, one would hope that'd be the case, Tom, and I appreciate your taking that on. Two things in my mind kept me from being able to make any proxy as to what the impact pointing, I'm sorry, any proxy that would give you the ability to determine what that would have on this. I had to pull a number out and say, okay, let's just say, for example, we have customer growth, we have load growth, and we're able to use these funds to maintain a certain level of keeping our emissions stable. So I just assumed going out to 2035 that our emissions were stable. They could go down, that would be awesome. I would be very happy on that. That's number one. But the second thing is that we take a look at the initiative. The initiative, through its complexity, you know, we just don't know what impact it would have, these programs that we're having, first of all qualifying, and then the substantial impact on reducing the liability of the carbon mix. So I had to come up with some number that was there and was stable that would give us an idea. At worst case scenario, here's what it's going to look like. And I appreciate your comments on that, because that would be an interesting second step to make to see.
It is complex, that's for sure. There's a lot of time in between and a lot of variables within that time frame.
Yeah. But it's one of the limitations of my model. You just pointed it out.
One of the other things I wanted to point out on that specific point about the through 2035 is the language in the bill also leaves room for the board to subsequently amend that percentage. And so that's a little bit concerning. Like, we didn't have that in I-937, but it leaves it really broad for that board to say, oh, we're not on the right trajectory, so therefore the $2 per year is not enough, we're gonna up that, or that to me is a little bit concerning that language is there.
That fits in with my next question, and my concern is about rulemaking, and I'm a little fuzzy on exactly how that works. How much latitude does commerce and ecology have in the context of rulemaking to affect our utility? And then I had one more question after that, easy one.
Well, a lot. That's the thing that's concerning.
Right.
Because there are some very simple things that you would think were rules under Initiative 937 that the Department of Commerce interpreted differently than the Public Utility Association and others. And so that's why I said earlier on, once you get into the meat grinder, that's where one of the major concerns is that how restrictive, how intricate, how complex is the program going to be? And we won't know that because the initiative cedes a lot of that authority to the agencies. And so that's why we're going to have to be very, very vigilant. We'll have to be vigilant when it gets to that point, and probably create some unique partnerships with utilities that we normally wouldn't be partnered with.
My last question in regards to costs, you mentioned $166,000 initially, and and you saw it going up by 3% and 2% over a period of years to about $475,000 approximately through 2035. What does that translate to for rate increases, potential rate increases for our PUD 3 customers?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. If we use the base, which is the determination, or at least the estimate from the PUD Association of $133,000 for the first year, and I'm going to use that year as just the base. Here we go. Considering the number of customers we have and the cost per month of that, we figure it would be about 33 cents per customer per month in the first year. But as you know, as we start moving forward, that goes up.
That compounds yearly at an increase rate of approximately 5%. 5% of 30.
It's $2 that gets added to the 15, and then they added 3% for CPI on top of that. So it's not 2% and 3%, it's $2. And then
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you,
for that
thank you,
clarification.
Justin. Yeah. So there would be a corresponding increase if, as we mentioned earlier, we maintain that current level of carbon emissions. If we're able to control that, that could dip, depending on the impacts of the programs that we do. But initially, we figured it was at 33% per customer impact. And
So that underscores your observation that Mason 3 is more minimally impacted than other utilities may be.
yes.
How bad was this bill beaten at the polls last time, Joel?
Before we came down here, I tried to find the latest poll numbers and I couldn't. It was like 50-50, I think, the last time I looked.
The old one? It just barely squeaked by. I thought it was kind of significant.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to get a new poll number. I really wasn't sure. So, but I will get back to you on that, Bruce.
Okay, well, it's obvious this thing has been rewritten for votes to try to get it to pass. Candy for many. Underneath, there's an increased bureaucracy to run it, extremely expensive. A lot of open need for them to do more mischief. And who is opposing it, and how heavy hitters are they?
The numbers have switched. It used to be that there was more money coming from the supporters of the proposal initially, but I want to say they're now even at $2 or $3 million each. And so the Association of Washington Business is one of the primary opponents of it.
AWB had to be.
Correct, yeah. And then the petroleum folks are opponents to it. A little bit surprising to see that labor is listed, because I know that one or two labor unions haven't supported it, as one might expect. But a lot of money being spent on this thing.
Okay, it's very dangerous. Anybody got anything else to say?
I'd like to bring up one more thing. We've talked about the direct impacts of the rates to our ratepayers through this initiative. But what we haven't talked about is the additional portion of the initiative, which would be in addition to transportation fuels. And I know the oyster industry is exempt because they're a maritime industry and wouldn't be paying these taxes. But most of our employed commuters would be burdened with extra taxes. But how much is that over a period of time? What would that be initially to price of a gallon of gas?
Boy, numbers in the back of my head, and if I said it, I know that it wouldn't be the correct one. But
It's not 16 cents, is it?
that sounds right.
But that's, I'm not sure.
15 cents, I was going to say 15, 16 cents a gallon. So you've got that issue going on there. There are impacts operationally as opposed to rates that we'd have to take a look at. And of course,
You mentioned that the utility was able to recover some of those costs through clean technology investment. But how does that translate to the commuter who is going to provide a family wage job for themselves and pay this tax? Where does that money fit into? Does that go That just goes into statewide initiatives like forest protection, that type of thing.
This would go into this overall fund to
Right.
divvy it up.
And divvied up the way it was showed out. So
Right.
they might be very well subsidizing some of our initiatives through their contribution from gas money to utilities, is that, or is it?
Especially if we're very successful on our grant seeking abilities and getting money back to us.
Okay, thank you.
I'm debating whether to thank you or not.
Once again, Lynn did the deep dive on this information and did an excellent job of boiling it down to its essence, and we worked together on the presentation here, and it's fascinating how complex this is going to be, more from the administrative standpoint in my mind, and the things that you've got to do to jump through the hoops, and the open-ended rulemaking stuff. Those are the areas that are my main concern in taking a look at this, because all sorts of mischief could happen between the adoption and the implementation.
Yeah, and we've got about the vote that comes out of about 3 of our major counties, compared to Eastern Washington and some of our rural counties who are a little bit more conservative. Anything else on that? Thanks, Joel.
Thank you.